Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Alan Broadbent, and I'm the chair and co-founder of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 10th anniversary event marking the founding of IMFG. And I do so on behalf of our director and co-founder, Enid Slack, who you'll be hearing from throughout the rest of the afternoon, and on behalf of our board and staff. We have an interesting program for you today, which will take a look at municipal finance and governance across time and geography. In addition to Enid, we're fortunate to have Richard Bird and Zach Taylor with us this afternoon. Before we launch into this afternoon's program, though, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about how IMFG came about. I'd been interested in cities and their place in Canada for a number of years, and had the privilege of working with Jane Jacobs and others, many of whom are in this room. A great deal of good work was done by many people on issues related to transit and transportation, land use, public health, culture, and the many other facets of urbanism. But almost every one of them bumped up against the same issue: finance. Where was the money going to come from to pay for the fundamental obligations of municipalities, whether there were obligatory obligations mandated by the province or aspirations of the city itself? Did the city in question have the fiscal capacity to cover its mandates or to achieve its vision of itself? Indeed, did the city have sufficient fiscal health to do anything more than struggle along, let alone prosper and thrive? The other bump in the road was governance. Did our cities have effective governance structures that could meet the challenges they faced? Were the mayors, councillors, and city staff equipped with the tools they needed to do the job? And did they have the powers that would allow them to control their own destinies? My colleagues and I, and principal among them was Mary Rowe, found ourselves asking where we should go to find out answers to these questions. Where was the place that did the research and accumulated the knowledge that could help move us forward? Which university hosted the institute, or what think tank was so particularly specialized? We did get answers to these questions, but what we found was a very small set of dispersed expertise, recognized gurus like Richard Bird and Harry Kitchen. And everyone we asked had one name to recommend: Enid Slack. Now, we knew Enid, for she had been active with us in our work, and we often found ourselves noodling problems long after meetings had broken up or conferences dispersed. So we raised the topic of creating that go-to place for municipal finance and governance, and it was a relatively short step from that point to the creation of IMFG. Now, Enid and I had some design principles at the outset. We wanted to focus on solutions rather than merely being a place of complaint. We were not merely going to describe problems, although that's important so we know what we're dealing with, but we would focus on solutions, on identifying what might work. We wanted to contribute to a vibrant discourse on issues, so we would seek out expert voices and new voices, often from other places. We wanted to do serious, high-quality research. And we wanted to develop a new generation of people interested in municipal finance and governance, so we wanted students coming through the Institute and contributing to the work. Over the 10 years, we've been able to stick to these principles pretty well, and we hope that they will serve us well going forward. We have held about 100 events such as this, had over 30 publications and 50 reports, and been published and covered in the media extensively, as we've tried to contribute to the urban discourse. Along the way, we've had tremendous support. We've had great support from TD Bank, where Vice President Scott Mullen saw the value of what we're trying to do early and helped with generous financial support. And Derek Burlton from TD Research has also been a steady supporter with expertise and program advice. The City of Toronto has also been a strong supporter, spearheaded by City Manager Joe Pinichetti and his predecessor, Shirley Hoy. And the Province of Ontario has made a tremendous difference with both their financial support and the participation of senior officials and politicians. And we've also had very helpful support from Diamante Development in supporting students coming through our programs. Now, I want to say a special word about Enid Slack. Our standard routine, as many of you might know, is that I introduce Enid as one of the top 5 experts on municipal finance in the world. And she informs the listener that there are only 5. Well, there are more than 5, and she is in the top 5, and in my book, she's number 1. She's been a wonderful colleague with whom to found the Institute, and has been relentless and clear-eyed in our development and in our commitment to quality. Without Enid, there would not be 10 years to celebrate, nor would there be people like you to celebrate with us. For one of the great gratifications of our 10 years is that we've attracted a serious and expert audience for our work. Now, I'm not going to say very much more about what a pleasure it's been to be associated with Enid in this endeavor, because we're about to put her to work in a few minutes, and along with Richard and Zach, and I don't want her to get a little soft-headed or her mind to wander. It is my pleasure now, though, to introduce Premier Kathleen Wynne. A brief bio of the Premier is in your program. I can't recall an Ontario Premier with such a deep knowledge of and interest in urban issues as Kathleen Wynne. In her elected life as a school trustee, MPP and cabinet minister, and now Premier, she has dealt with the key aspects of urban life and municipal issues. She has also, in her life as a citizen, been actively engaged in these issues, and particularly with municipal finance and governance. As Torontonians dealt with amalgamation in the 1990s, she was a leader in defining what it would mean to our democracy and to the ability of our municipalities to maintain their fiscal health. She was instrumental in developing an informed discourse and in engaging a wide group to consider the issue, one of the most successful citizen engagements in the history of the Toronto region. At the Ontario government, she's held cabinet positions in municipal affairs and housing, transportation, education, and Aboriginal affairs, all portfolios with major urban implications. She's dealt with the issues in these ministries with her characteristic thoughtfulness, intelligence, and determination. When we were wondering who might be the ideal person to sound the keynote for the IMFG on its 10th anniversary, then the Premier was at the top of the list, and we were delighted when she accepted our invitation. I'm particularly pleased because she is someone I've liked and admired since the days our kids were in school together, and who in her public life I've seen as a person of great integrity and capability. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Premier Kathleen Wynne.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. You're way too kind. And I just want to say, looking out at this crowd, it's a bit rich of me to be talking to you about municipal finance and governance, because there's a lot of expertise in this room. So I want to just acknowledge that off the top. But Enid and Alan, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of tonight's celebration. And I want to congratulate everyone at the Institute for the 10 years of research and excellent solutions that you have put forward. I'm really honored to be here with the planners and lawyers and academics and advocates. All of you are, I know, passionate about community and cities. I do think Mary Rowe is listening to us somehow. I know that she was very much part of your original discussions, and as a friend, I know that she's with us, even though she's not here physically. So I'm grateful that you came together. I understand that of all the orders of government, municipalities are the closest to our daily lives, and you only have to be a politician for a very short time and knock on a few doors to know that really what people are concerned about are the potholes in front of their house. They're not. It takes a while to get to the other issues. So the local government profoundly affects our quality of life, and the quality of life in turn then becomes a barometer for success. And so it's very important to me that we get this right. This relationship. It's how municipal governance is how a place attracts talent, capital, culture, and commerce, and the combination of factors that led to what is frequently termed the rise of cities. And over the last century, obviously the accelerating pace of change has been profound, it's been far-reaching, but I think of particular significance for policymakers is the rise of cities as economic actors in their own right. And I know that that is what you have been talking about. So when businesses decide where to invest, they look at the state of infrastructure in a city, at how transit and transportation will affect their productivity, and whether a city has the cluster of expertise that they're looking for. I experienced this over and over again as recently as when I was in China, and the conversations that I had with businesses that were looking at Ontario and trying to make decisions. These were the issues that they raised with us. So policy decisions that are made at the municipal level help to shape the city's reputation and in turn its global competitiveness, and by extension that of the province and the countries. And we know that more and more policy decisions are being made by other orders of government, are having a direct impact on a municipality's ability to remain competitive, to deliver the services that improve people's lives, and to do what cities are called on increasingly to do, and that is to drive the economic growth of the nation. And that, I think, is an important reality. I think that these ideas are better understood, but for a long time, municipal government remained, I think, understudied by academia and undervalued in the Canadian media, and an effort was needed to shift those attitudes and to foster a more collaborative approach between the levels of government and between municipal governments themselves. And I think the IMFG has been a big part of that effort. And Alan and Enid recognized the need to close the gap between the importance and the profile of local government, because that was a gap that was not well understood. They saw how the municipal role was changing, and they rightly determined that our future prosperity would depend on our capacity to understand the change and to embrace it. So it's hard to believe that it's 10 years ago since the founding of the Institute, and the insightful evidence-based analysis that has done so much to change the way policymakers and citizens think about municipalities has become important to the whole discussion and discourse about cities. Its reports have offered a wealth of insights into a full range of municipal issues. So financing transit expansion, how the millennial generation is reshaping our cities, the economic impact of new municipal taxes. And that's been a terrific resource for communities across Ontario as they grappled with all of these complex issues: amalgamation, growth planning, transit funding, downloading and infrastructure renewal, among so many more. And I think that the cumulative effect of this work has helped to create the current environment where we can have a number of discussions that 10 years ago we would not have been able to have. We have a public that is increasingly informed and engaged in municipal issues, and political and policy leaders with a genuine desire for collaboration. Now, I don't think that is universal, but I do think that we are in a better place than we were. My own experience is telling on this front. I was first elected as an MPP at about the same time that the Institute was created, and it was at about that same time that I met many of you in this room. For various reasons. And I was propelled into provincial politics because of my experience at the municipal level as a school trustee, but also as a concerned citizen during the amalgamation. And Alan, I appreciate you calling me a leader in that movement. I have to acknowledge John Sewell, because it was John who really pulled me into this realm and brought together the people who formed that group, and in that way formed the discussion about the city going forward. One of the things that motivated me, in fact, to run for provincial politics, so I wouldn't say one, but the thing that motivated me was Mike Harris's real contempt of municipal actors, whether it was at the school board level or whether it was at the city council level. So when we won in 2003, I knew how critical it was for our new government to rebuild those relationships with municipalities, and that rebuilding had to be founded on collaboration and mutual respect. Otherwise, there wasn't going to be the change that we needed. And I would suggest that we have to a certain extent. I think our government has made great progress in providing municipalities with fiscal breathing room. We've uploaded programs to the province, and that has more than tripled our ongoing financial support for municipalities. We have given this breathing room, and local governments have been able to focus more of their property tax dollars on infrastructure and economic development. We introduced the City of Toronto Act, which allowed the City of Toronto to have some more of the tools and the autonomy that it needed. We've created one of the largest green belts in the world, revamped our land use planning policies to promote sustainable development, and together made our communities more transit and pedestrian friendly and forced development on growth nodes. We're reversing years of chronic underinvestment across our province in highways, bridges, buses, and subways. And, you know, that backlog of need was so apparent when we came into office, that there had been years when those issues had not been addressed, and I am not suggesting that the problem is completely solved. But I am saying that we've recognized that it was an issue and we have tackled it. So municipalities are seeing new growth, and that's fueled by some of the biggest public infrastructure projects in Ontario's history. The Confederation Line LRT in Ottawa, the Eglinton LRT in Toronto being two examples. And as I say, that's not to say that there aren't critical challenges still facing municipalities. I know that there are, you know that there are. We're all in tough budget situations, and so as we deliver on our commitment to eliminate the provincial deficit, it's vital that we continue to have honest conversations with our municipal partners, and we're committed to that. Supported by the Institute's research and the strong partnerships that we have in place, I'm optimistic about what we can achieve. I'm not suggesting that those will be easy discussions at every turn, but I think that it's important that we have them. So, for example, a recent IMFG perspectives paper showed just how extensively local governments are already collaborating on shared service delivery. And I was just talking to Zach Spicer, who wrote the paper, and he points out that the toughest part of building strong partnerships is creating the right conditions for cooperation, getting council and staff buy-in, and building trust. And I think that he makes very good points, and there are good examples across the province where this is happening. I think there's another aspect, and I was just talking to Zach about this, not just intergovernment, but intra-municipal realm, and that is that school boards and municipal councils need to have a much better way of cooperating, whether it's shared service or whether it is on real estate. But I think that that's an area that we have not got the right policy tools in place, and it's something that I would love to hear from people on what we might be able to do on that. And I obviously have a particular bias having come from the school board background, but I think that when I look across the province, there is much that we could do there. Over the past decade, our government has worked to help municipalities to create the conditions that encourage the kind of intermunicipal agreements that are in place and that need to be in place. And we work closely with our municipal leaders. We have an ongoing dialogue with municipalities, whether it's one-on-one in terms of mayors or whether it's the ongoing and monthly dialogue with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. And in fact, I reference the kind of ongoing connection that we have with municipalities when I talk about what I think there needs to be in terms of relationship between the federal government and provincial governments, that kind of relationship where the players know each other is extremely important. In addition to that, in our current caucus of 58 MPPs, 20 have a background in local government. So that also adds to the knowledge around the table when we're talking about these issues. We understand, therefore, that we have a crucial part to play in helping municipalities to address future challenges. I hope that we're seeing signs that a new era of cooperation is unfolding. I hope that's what we're seeing. In the wake of the 2013 ice storm, the affected municipalities came together. They were convened by Hazel McCallion, and then they came together and worked with the province, not as individual jurisdictions, but as a region. And in my recent conversation with John Tory, we talked about the need for that kind of cooperation and coordination across the GTHA, and that it's the surest way for all of us to meet our challenges and to create the opportunities that we know are possible. New mandates, I think, have given us a chance to come together, and so I look forward to that. But it's a chance that we can't afford to miss, so we have to seize it, and we have to act quickly. This year, on another front, we'll work with our partners to review the growth plan and the Green Belt, and work to ensure that we're planning the kind of cities that support sustainable growth and are globally competitive for years to come. I know that there are challenges on that front, and we have to make sure that we get that right, that review. John and I will both be at the Civic Action meeting tomorrow, and there will be mayors from across and regional chairs from all over the GTHA there. And I hope that we will cover a range of subjects, but one of the topics we'll be covering is transit. We have a broad consensus that large infrastructure investments like those needed to improve the transit networks in the GTHA are essential in order for people to be able to flourish in this, as I said, in the global environment. And we'll discuss also how on this and other issues we can bring every order of government to the table and work to make progress. And I think that is a key point. I've referenced the relationship with the federal government, and some of you will know that I made a speech in Ottawa last week at the Canada 2020 meeting, and the comments there where I called for an economic union across the country, but I focused on a Canadian infrastructure partnership, and I think that collaboration with the federal government that has an explicit objective of investing 5% of our GDP in infrastructure renewal is an important one. It's something I will continue to talk about. Right now, with the current provincial, municipal, and some federal contribution, there's about a 3 to 3.5% of GDP in investment. We know that only barely maintains the infrastructure levels that we need, and we know that if we can get to 5%, we can start to build and grow. But we know that right now municipalities and provinces are stretched, and so we need to have that federal partner. So I want a real discussion with the federal government on this, not unlike the reality that some cities would like to talk with the province about whether it's time to give new revenue tools to larger municipalities other than just Toronto. More than one mayor has raised this with me. It's a discussion that I'm open to having, and we need to be willing to consider every option that will support the rise of our cities. Revenue tools that give municipalities the fiscal space to grow, at the same time balancing the need to remain competitive, have worked elsewhere, and we need to remain open to this idea in all of the forms that it could possibly take. So I'm not making a plug for a specific mechanism, but I am saying that this is an important conversation. And the fact that this conversation is inseparable from the finance and governance work done at IMFG, I think speaks to the incredible impact that the Institute has had in its 10 years. And as I said before, the fact that this conversation is possible speaks to how far we've come over a decade of building provincial and municipal partnerships and building that trust and shared purpose that is necessary. So I look forward to what comes next. We have to continue to build these partnerships and to build healthy, sustainable communities. I want to congratulate Alan and Enid and everyone at IMFG for the 10 years of leadership that you have already established. And thank you to everyone here today who I know many of you have worked so hard for so many years on building up our cities and putting forward the ideas that are necessary for us to be a sustainable and a prospering province and conglomeration of cities. So thank you very much. Merci.
Well, thank you very much, Premier Wynne, for those important and encouraging comments. We greatly appreciate your being with us this afternoon and the leadership your government is showing for cities in Ontario and across the country. I would like, if I may be so bold, to clear up one lingering impression you might have made when you talked about our good friend Mary Rowe, when you said she was listening and she is unfortunately not with us today. She is alive. That's right. She's alive in New York in the snow, the Premier says. But Mary is a good friend and has worked with many of us in this room and was an important part of the start of the Institute. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel, and while I'm doing so, if you wouldn't mind coming up and taking your seats up at the front, For each of them, there's a brief descriptive note in the program, so I won't repeat that. I've already referred to Enid Slack, one of the top 5 municipal experts in the world. We're fortunate to have 2 of the other 4 with us. Richard Bird is in many ways the Dean of Municipal Finance, a renowned economist who has worked internationally with the World Bank and a variety of governments at the national, subnational, and city level. He's been a valued senior fellow at IMFG and contributed greatly to our work. Zach Taylor is a professor at the U of T Scarborough and one of the rising stars in the municipal finance and governance world, and he was an IMFG graduate fellow. Enid will take a look at municipal finance in Canada, past, present, and future. Richard will look at what is happening internationally, and Zach will talk about the state of governance in Canadian municipalities. We're pleased you're all with us today, so Enid, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm actually wearing 2 hats today. One is director of IMFG, but the other is as a panelist. So I'm not going to respond to all of those introductory comments that Alan made earlier until I get to the end and I act as director. Right now I'm going to be a panelist. I am delighted to have this opportunity on the occasion of our 10th anniversary to reflect on what has happened in municipal finance in Canada over the last 10 years and to think about where we go from here. I'm also delighted that I'm going to be able to highlight some of the research that we have been doing at IMFG. I really have 3 main points that I want to raise as I look past, present, and future. The first point, and I'll go into these a bit more later, is that there have been some positive developments over the last 10 years, and the Premier mentioned some of them. But in some ways, not much has changed, and I'll talk about why. The second point I'd like to make is that the fiscal health of our cities is pretty good, but there are some looming challenges on the horizon. And the third point I'd like to make is that it's a point we made 10 years ago. Canadian cities need more revenue tools and more fiscal autonomy, but they could also do more with what they have. So those are the 3 main points that I'm going to come back to. What's happened in the last 10 years? Well, there's been lots of talk about cities. How many times have you heard that cities are the engines of economic growth? How many times? But 10 years ago, we weren't saying this. It's really something we've been saying more recently. We've also heard that we need good services and we need solid, adequate infrastructure. But the real question always boils down to is how do we pay for it? At our inaugural event in 2005, we talked about the pending City of Toronto Act, which came out in 2006. And one of the things we stressed at that time was the city, and other cities in Canada, not just Toronto, need more revenue tools and more fiscal autonomy. And by that we mean more decision-making ability over the use of those tools. We said it in IMFG again in 2011 when we talked about financing metropolitan areas. Well, what has happened since then? Well, we do have the City of Toronto Act, which came out in 2006, which allows the city to levy a range of financing tools, except for income taxes, sales taxes, fuel taxes, hotel taxes, and some of the other major revenue tools. We've had the uploading of social service costs in Ontario, which reversed the downloading that had begun in the late 90s onto municipalities. If we look at Saskatchewan, the province there is sharing provincial sales tax revenues with municipalities. If we look to Alberta, we see the cities of Edmonton and Calgary talking to the province about new city charters. Now, we don't yet know what that means, and we certainly don't know what it means for revenue tools, but there's got to be some discussion about that in these city charters. And if we look federally, we see the New Deal for cities and communities with gas tax sharing at the federal level, and some provinces are doing the same. So we have seen some changes over the last 10 years. But when we look at the data, it doesn't show much change. If we look at the information, the data for 2012, and interestingly, Statistics Canada, which stopped producing local government data in 2008, has started up again, so we can actually look at 2012. Looking across Canada, property taxes account for 54% of total municipal revenues. User fees are 22%. Transfers from the federal and provincial governments combined are 18%, and other revenues are 6%. It hasn't changed much. Property taxes are up a little, not very much. Transfers are up a little, not very much. User fees are almost exactly the same, and other revenues have gone down a bit. So there has been change, but in some ways there hasn't. What does it mean for the fiscal health of cities? Well, at IMFG over the last 10 years, that has been a major emphasis of what we've been doing. We have been focusing on the fiscal health of cities in Canada and around the world. In fact, we have a book coming out early March called Is Your City Fiscally Healthy? Measuring Urban Fiscal Health. And in this book, we look at what fiscal health means and how do you measure it, and we also look at examples from Ontario, Quebec, US cities, and cities in other OECD countries. We also did a pre-election paper on the fiscal health of Toronto. And what did we find? Well, you may recall this finding. Toronto's fiscal health is like that of an aging Maple Leafs defenseman. Maybe a solid performer on the ice and well cared for by training staff, but he's increasingly expensive and in need of major knee surgery. That is a now famous quote, which got a lot of play at the time. I have to tell you a secret, and my co-author Andre Cote is sitting at the back. Moments before this paper was going to be printed, he came into my office and said, "Should we leave that analogy in there, the Maple Leaf defenseman?" I said, "Well, it really doesn't make any sense at all." So we decided to explain it and leave it in. And as I say, it's probably the most often quoted line that we have ever written at IMFG in 10 years. But what we were saying is simply this. And my advice to people who want to get media attention, Maple Leafs, really good way to do it in Toronto. Anything about the Maple Leafs. But what we were trying to say, and we did write this as well so people would understand what this was all about, the fiscal health of Toronto looks good by many measures, such as property taxes, debt levels, those kinds of measures. But there are huge infrastructure challenges, both to build new infrastructure, but also maintain existing infrastructure in the state of good repair, and especially in transportation and housing. Now, we said this about Toronto, but honestly, we could have said it about any major city in Canada. So, where do we go from here? How do we actually get more revenue tools and fiscal autonomy for cities? And what is different now than 10 years ago? Well, we had an IMFG paper written by Andre Cote and Michael Fenn that talked about provincial municipal relations in Ontario. And that paper suggests that the time may have come for provincial empowerment of cities. And they came to that conclusion by looking in the past, by looking at the history of provincial municipal relations, and finding that provincial restraint has been a catalyst for reform of that provincial municipal relationship. I think we are certainly in a time of restraint, so perhaps there's an opportunity here to empower cities to raise some more revenues on their own. But it's not just about new tools, as I said in my introduction. Cities need to use the tools they have more effectively. We have 2 new IMFG studies that are coming out shortly that point to areas where cities could do more. I've written a paper with Richard Bird and Almash Tashani that shows that many municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area have room to increase residential property taxes. We look at something called revenue hills, which basically says if you increase the tax rate, the revenues will go up, and that will continue to happen. At some point, you increase the tax rate, and revenues start to fall because Property values fall, people leave. And we found that certainly for residential property taxes, most municipalities, including the City of Toronto, most municipalities in the GTA are not at the top of the revenue hill. They can increase those taxes. Kyle Hanneman, who was a postdoc fellow with us, has written a paper that again is coming out soon on municipal borrowing. And in his paper, he suggests that municipalities could borrow more to pay for infrastructure, especially in the current climate of low interest rates. So yes, cities need more revenue tools and more autonomy, more fiscal autonomy, but they do have some tools that they could be doing a better job of using. Well, how do we get cities to do that? How do we get cities to move on these things? Even if we could convince the provinces in Canada to empower cities, would cities use the tools that are granted to them? Look at the vehicle registration tax in Toronto. We brought in a vehicle registration tax. What did it last for? A couple of years? Not even? And it's gone. We have politicians promising zero tax increases or very low tax increases, not more than the rate of inflation, in order to get elected. And yet, everyone wants clean water. Everyone wants a good transit system. Everybody wants good parks and libraries. So how do we get people to agree to pay for it? And that's really a political economy question. This goes beyond economics into the political economy. And we have looked at this question as well. Richard Bird and I wrote a paper that suggests we have to strengthen the connection between local expenditures and local revenues. We call it the Wixellian connection, or it is called the Wixellian connection. But the point is really that when people know what they're getting, what services they're getting, they're happier, never happy, but happier to pay taxes, to pay for them. We held a series on transportation funding over the course of 2011 and 2012. And we brought in speakers mainly from the US, and they told us that dedicated taxes for transit to improve mobility and reduce travel time have generated public support in the US. They have these ballot initiatives or referenda where people agree with a two-thirds majority to pay higher taxes for transit. Andy Manahan's enjoying this, I know, because he's is very interested in this topic. But when people know that the money is going for transit in their community rather than going to Washington in their case, they're happier to pay the increased taxes. And it's interesting to see that Vancouver plans to hold a referendum to increase the provincial sales tax in Metro Vancouver to pay for transit improvements. The first in Canada, so we'll be watching that with a lot of interest. What about the federal and provincial governments? What should they be doing? Well, one of the themes we've had here at IMFG is that they need to treat different cities and communities differently. Federal and provincial governments need to be strategic. Toronto isn't the same as Timmins. The cities are different. Andre Cote and I did a paper for the UK government last year, which highlights the asymmetric treatment of cities in the United Kingdom. They have city deals there. They call them bespoke arrangements or tailored arrangements. And these deals support economic development, and they are negotiated with each city. So Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, they're all different agreements. And that seems to work. So that's a very quick, because I haven't had a lot of time to go through some of the research we have done in the last 10 years, what we've learned in the last 10 years, and where we think things are headed. So where does IMFG go from here? Well, we plan to continue to do work on the fiscal health of cities. We think this is still very important, and there's a lot more work to be done. For example, we have a paper that we've commissioned that we will receive soon on municipal pensions and the impact that they have on fiscal health, because around the time of Detroit's bankruptcy, everybody asked us about Canadian municipalities. And there's some differences across Canada, and we'll be looking at those. We want to do more work on governance. Is a strong mayor system better than a weak mayor system? Is party politics a good idea at the local level? How do we encourage civic engagement? How do we get more accountability? So we're going to do a whole stream in the coming years on governance. And a new area we're hoping to get into is the impact of climate change and extreme weather on municipal finance. Other countries have been working on this. When I travel, I find that when I'm talking about local government, you're in a country like Australia, you're talking about local government, immediately the issue of climate change and extreme weather comes up. It doesn't come up as quickly here, but we need to think about it. We also hear a lot about big data. That's one of the new areas, the new buzzwords. And we want to look a little bit at the role of big data in improving local service delivery and fostering economic growth. And of course, we will continue to publish all of our research and make it available on our website so that we can continue to inform and elevate the public debate on these issues and hopefully provoke policymakers to make the changes that will improve how our cities are financed and governed. Thank you very much.
You know, I spent most of my life as a teacher in universities. It's kind of a frustrating way to spend your career, frankly. And the only good part about it is you do have some really good students, and you've just heard one of my best students. The other initial reflection that comes to my mind since I'm near the end of my career, I began much of my career with the IMF. I'm ending it with the IMFG. Is G going up or down? Anyway, I only want to make 3 points in these remarks. I'm supposed to take a global perspective. So I'm, instead of in the muck of the city looking up, I'm up in the stars looking down. The first point is very simple. We're not alone. Cities and local governments all over the world face similar problems. Political units almost never match economic realities, and money's hard to come by. No one escapes. No one. Second, a lot of the problems that people face in any particular country turn out to be fairly universal. You find almost the same problem everywhere. And, you know, like Enid, I've been everywhere, so I really have found the same problems. That means you can learn quite a lot from what other people do when facing similar problems. The third thing, however, is that you can never take anyone else's solution and put it right in your city. Local adaptation is critical to success. You have to get people to buy it. You have to work it out in a way that, in fact, deals with the problems as they arise in your city. You've got to do a lot of local work on it. So those are my 3 points. Now, I'll come at them this way. I was going to start with when I was a kid, but that's so long ago, it's into some other geologic age. When the Institute was launched 10 years ago, Canada was already a largely urban country. By the way, the word urban is a very loose word in statistical terms, and I shift definitions about 3 times in the course of the next 5 minutes. I'm not going to explain that. It's already a largely urban country with about 80% of the population in urban areas and about 1/3 in the 3 largest cities, which I trust you all know are still Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. At that time, however, most people in the world were still living in rural areas. What's happened in the last 10 years? Quite a lot. The tide of urbanization is coming in pretty quickly. Over half the world now lives in urban areas. If we look ahead a few years, as the latest UN projections suggest, which is what, 35 years, 2/3 of the world's population, which is 6 billion people, that's more people than were on the planet at the beginning of this century, are going to be living in urban areas. Again, I shifted definitions there on you, but so did all the data sources. The scale and pace of recent and anticipated urban growth on this planet is unprecedented. We have more people in bigger cities than we've ever seen before, and much of this growth will take place in large cities. Toronto, if we broadly define it as, in fact, the Premier did a moment ago, the GTHA area has around 6 million people. It's by far the biggest urban area in Canada, by far. But it doesn't make the first 50 in the world. In fact, by the UN standards, Canada just barely makes the large city criterion, which is 5 million. I mean, Toronto does, 5 million. to be a really big, and the other two, what were the names of those obscure medium-sized cities that I mentioned a moment ago? I mean, it's not really big news. So that's put us in proportion. There's a lot bigger places. There are 30 megacities, that's people with more than 10 million people. The largest megacity is Tokyo. There's more people in the Tokyo metropolitan region than in all of Canada. That's a big city. But there's going to be another 10 or 12 of those coming along in the next 10 years. There's going to be another 1 million people move into the Toronto metropolitan area, as defined broadly a moment ago, by 2030, according to current projections. But by then, Toronto will not be any longer in this proud place as 56th largest urban area in the world. It'll have slipped about 12 places. It'll be about 68th. So we're big, we're growing, but we're not that big, and we're not growing that fast. So if we have problems, think what the problems are in a lot of the rest of the world. So there's a lot going on out there, a lot we can learn from. One other thing that's important, most of this urbanization is not, in fact, taking place in these very large cities. It's taking place in smaller cities. Not teeny cities like Calgary, but smaller cities. And it's got so we have to look at what's going on across a wide range of cities. Interestingly, in almost all these cities, in rich countries and in poor, while we see the tall urban towers springing up in Toronto and elsewhere, that's not where the growth is coming in. It's suburbanization. You're seeing the suburbanization of the world, not the urbanization. It's not highly dense growth. It's spread out. And this is a very interesting problem that we haven't paid nearly enough attention to. The fact that you're both growing this way and this way. And these two things working together, it turns out to be a major problem. I'll come back to this in a moment. Anyway, the problems. As Enid mentioned, even the best-run cities seldom find that the revenues they directly have under their control meet the needs and demands of their residents. Cities usually get, in most countries, almost all countries, cities actually have the same revenue sources as other local governments. But they're not the same, as Enid mentioned. In fact, they're not only larger, but they're denser and they're also richer. And they have a more heterogeneous population as a rule. And all of these things affect both their costs and their possibilities of raising funds. But they almost never have a governance structure that lets them adequately deal with these problems, because there isn't any governance structure that encompasses the economic regions within which these cities are located and for which they are the immediate engines, to use that phrase again. So there's seldom a single metropolitan government. In fact, the only place I really know that does it really thoroughly is probably Cape Town. But we have Singapore, of course, and we have some countries with city-states, which is a thing that's often been suggested. China, this is the way China is going with 5 city-state provinces now, although they all have very urban areas and non-urban areas. Germany has done that to a small extent. History did it really for Germany to a small extent. There are big city governments like London, which Enid mentioned, which cover a very broad area, but actually have less fiscal autonomy, less fiscal power than Toronto does. There's all kinds of American cities, big and small, that have far more fiscal power than Toronto does. There's a huge mixture of experience out there, but all I would say is that no one's got it right. Now, if there's a problem that no one ever gets right, there's 3 conclusions you can draw. That we're all pretty stupid, that it really is a big, difficult problem that we're still kind of figuring out. That's kind of my view on it all. Or that, in fact, there's no one problem. There are thousands, and there are different composites of these sets of problems all around the world, and everybody has their own problems that they have to deal with. I think it's kind of like a marriage. You kind of got to work this stuff out. But it's a problem. What the system is right now is that almost all the biggest cities in the world, in fact, all of them, are highly dependent on upper-level governments. That's why everybody attacks, say, you get a provincial politician in the room or a federal politician and say, please, sir, hold your hands out. You got the money, give it to us, because we can spend it better than you can. I think you've heard that before. But And they're right to ask, because many of the deficiencies in both governance and finance come because of the constraints that are put on local governments by higher level governments. And so it's a constant matter of concern for people in higher level governments, how you structure these systems, how they work. It's partly a concern because the people who think they have potholes in the road in front of their house are just as likely to complain to the provincial or federal politicians as they are to the local one. And that's a problem. And one way that's handled in some countries is by kicking all of these functions up. I remember when I was in Jakarta many years ago, the president of the country actually had to approve changes in urban bus routes. You know, this is ludicrous. You should be grateful. But you do see this kind of thing. You also get problems because you have a lot of different governments which are kind of responsible in different ways to different levels of government, public agencies, which are providing services within the urban area. One of the first projects Enid and I ever worked on was attempting to pull for the tri-level task force on public finance, right? We were trying to put together a total picture of the expenditures of all levels of a government in an urban area. I think it was Winnipeg or something we were looking at, I've forgotten. But there was, we never were able to do it. The data wasn't big enough. It was little data, and you couldn't do it with little data. I think maybe you could do that much better now with big data, and that's one of the things I'm hoping we will be able to get to more. But we really don't understand very well exactly how services are provided, how different governments, public agencies interact in providing these services, and especially when we have an increasing number of quasi-public activities that are taking place too that are relevant. Now, I think a lot of these problems are really governance problems. The financial problems of cities, and I've always been a finance guy, are actually not that difficult. As Enid said a moment ago, though nobody ever likes to hear this, you could all pay more property taxes. You really want more local services. You better start thinking about the fact you're going to be paying more property taxes. That's going to happen. I don't care what politicians say to you. You want services, you're going to pay for them. And that's good. You should. At least that's my view. My wife, who handles the finance in the family, probably wouldn't agree with me, but that's my view anyway. The property taxes and user charges that Canadian cities have at their disposal are adequate to finance their activities so long as they're not financing education, health, and housing, things like that. And they really shouldn't be financing those to any great extent. They could be acting as agents for other levels of government and delivering services in those areas, but they aren't really things that I think local government should be financing, particularly in larger metropolitan areas. But we could finance a lot of stuff, including rapid transit. One of the activities that you didn't mention is that she and I are doing some work on financing rapid transit, and I can't imagine anybody in the room is going to like the results. And anyway, I have a principle which is that you shouldn't subsidize anybody if you can possibly avoid it. So cities should be encouraged and assisted to price, this comes back to my IMF days. Cities should be encouraged and assisted in pricing their scarce public resources properly. What's the main public resource in the city? It's actually space. We don't price space properly. Developers try to, but that's a very limited kind of space. And the green belt stuff is something you have to think about a great deal in this context. So I think that we could do much more about, let's call it self-financing urban areas, but it would require changing a lot of governance and finance structures, and it's unlikely we're going to do any of that very soon. And one reason people haven't managed to resolve these complex issues is because, in a democracy, and this is what it means to be in a democracy, you can only make changes by negotiations and discussions with all kinds of interested parties, and inevitably it's a process of compromise. And a process of compromise, nobody ever quite gets what they want. That's actually what democracy does. And it's working properly, but it does mean that whatever you manage to do is never quite right and not going to last that long, probably because pressures will require you to make other compromises to deal with the new changes. It doesn't mean you should cease trying to improve things, but I think it means it's an ongoing process that you have to continue to work with. It's the process that's important of negotiation and discussion, much more than the specifics of any particular context. And what we're trying to do in organizations like this one, I think, is really to provide more evidence. I mean, whatever our own opinions are, we try to base them on actual things that we can sort of demonstrate, and hopefully other people can see and take that into their thinking when they think about these same issues. It's not that we have the answers, it's that a lot of things that are presented to you as answers are not answers. Finally, the last point was what's the solutions? I'm always much better at setting out problems than I am at finding solutions. I failed on the World Bank and the IMF and so on because I was never quite prepared to tell the Minister of Finance, he should do this. You got to be strong about that. And I always said, well, maybe you should do this if this is, and that was never considered quite good enough. But the problem is that while everybody has to make up their own, they're kind of like, there's a whole set of remedies out there. Some are, from traditional medicine, some are the new modern medicine, statistically driven, evidence-driven medicine. But you have to compound your own prescription for what you determine are your own ills in order to do it. So everybody's their sort of own doctor and their own pharmacist. And you can imagine if we actually had to do all that stuff ourselves, how well we would do. Well, that's kind of the way we run cities. We sort of sit around and noodle about these things, and we pull various bits and pieces we happen to know or that somebody else mentions to us or we read in the paper or I heard at the store the other day, and that's the evidence on which we build. So we do really quite well given the way we do it. It's probably as good a way as any. But the one thing I will say is that don't ever believe a politician who tells you that they will not raise taxes and they will at the same time increase services. Not going to happen. It's no answer ever lies in expecting other people to pay for something to benefit you. They may want to do this out of the goodness of their heart. Don't count on it. So I don't think that's the solution. There's no solution either in saying cities should simply tax and spend better. Of course they should. They can. They should. But that's not going to resolve the process either, or the problems either. Local governments in particular can't solve problems this way for the reason I mentioned at the beginning, and that's the starting point of all this. Local governments are at the bottom of the heap. They do not write their own constitutions. They do not decide what their fiscal resources are. They do not decide what they're spending them on, basically. Sure, they do lots of details, but not in broad, not like a federal government can or a provincial government in a country like Canada can largely do. Local governments simply can't do that. But it has to work within a lot of constraints. So it's really up to the people who live in cities to see they get the leadership that will deliver what they need, and it's up to those leaders to figure out how they can possibly get elected while at the same time telling voters the truth. That it's both fair and necessary that you pay for what you get and that you are only going to get what you pay for. So there you are, depression. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I was really pleased to get this invitation. The IMFG and Enid Slack personally have been such great support. Your mentorship, your support over the last number of years has been excellent for me as a grad student as I worked my way up, and I can say that I could not teach the courses that I teach today without the output of the Institute. As I teach local government, local public finance, and so on. So I'm really very pleased to have been invited. Thanks to the Institute, we know more now than has been known in decades, I think, about municipal finance especially and local governance, particularly in Toronto and Ontario, but also elsewhere in Canada and around the world. But I think there's so much more that we don't know and so much that we should know. And I hope the Institute continues continues its good work in future years to try to expand our knowledge and be able to relate our local situation to other places. In the brief time I have today, I want to pick up on some of the themes introduced by Enid Slack and consider current demands for local autonomy in relation to the ability of municipalities and urban regions to manage long-term change and meet unexpected challenges. And I may strike a bit of a contrarian note at some points, but and maybe that can spur discussion. As a political scientist rather than an economist, I'm most interested in governance and governability of urban regions as social and economic spaces and built-in natural environments. And that may direct me in a slightly different direction than where the economist may go. To jump in, lately I've become interested in an idea that has gained currency in recent years of urban resilience. This concept has been discussed by the Brookings Institution, by the World Bank, various academics, various consultant groups, and so on. But the basic idea here is that some cities seem to bounce back from adverse events and conditions better than others, and we want to figure out why that may be the case. Much of the discussion and research on this topic has been on the capacity of cities to respond to sudden shocks, such as natural disasters, economic recessions, or armed conflict. In essence, the capacity of governments, social and economic networks, and infrastructure systems to bend but not break under pressure. I think we should expand this beyond the idea of the sudden shock. These certainly do test the resilience of metropolitan areas, but so too do what we might call slow shifts, incremental long-term transformations, for example, in the nature of work, the structure of the economic base, the demographic composition of the population, lifestyles, household structures, energy costs, and the natural environment. So an urban region's ability to anticipate, mitigate, adapt to, absorb the impacts of both sudden shocks and slow shifts, some of them predictable, so others not, is fundamentally a governance question. So this is where I see in the program I'm supposed to talk about governance, so this is where I'm getting there. This is because it is governments, and in Canada most especially the provincial governments, that set the rules within which local governments operate and define the incentive structures within which urban development occurs. Now, Canada's major cities may be small potatoes, as Richard Bird says, in a broader international context, but they are some of the fastest growing in the developed world, and they're being transformed in the process. So the operative question, I think, is, are Canada's local governments up to the job of anticipating and managing long-term social, economic, and environmental transformations, fiscally, administratively, and politically? And I'm thinking of land use planning, service delivery, and infrastructure provision. Are our local governments up to the job? And IMFG has tackled the question of fiscal health and provincial-municipal relations in sort of their immediate terms. And I highly recommend this, the recent paper by Andre Cote and Michael Fenn, which I think really lays out a lot of these issues very clearly. But I think it's also worth thinking about from a perspective that is more holistic, more long-term, thinking perhaps more on the 50 to 100-year plan. Something that has struck me in my research on the historical development of Ontario's local government, going back to the 19th century, is that perhaps more so than any other jurisdiction in North America, the provincial government has actively managed the municipalities as a system. While the specific goals and institutional choices have changed significantly over time, the province has repeatedly intervened to ensure that municipal governments have the fiscal and administrative capacity to remain solvent and do their jobs. In doing so, and again, more than any other province or state, the Ontario government has maintained a high degree of uniformity or symmetry in its treatment of municipalities and in the assignment of municipal authority. Now, these days, as we've discussed, the dominant demand is for greater local autonomy and for the customization of authority of large municipalities. And this claim has several facets. First, it's argued that local governments are closest to the community, and therefore they should be given more authority and fiscal resources to solve community problems on their own. Second, it's often argued that specific large urban centers have different needs than small cities and rural areas. Toronto is not Timmins, as we've heard, and so their local governments need additional power and resources. And finally, some have also argued that if local governments have greater responsibilities and the autonomy to exercise them, they'll attract political leadership that is more creative, more nimble, and more talented. So while I'm sympathetic to these demands, to the idea that local autonomy and differential authority for large municipalities could be a good thing, I think we need to think about the implications. Increasing autonomy may bring benefits, but it may also have dark sides, and I think we need to sort of weigh those things. Looking south of the border, we see a pattern of local government arrangements that can barely be called a system in any state. As a result of identical demands over a century ago, American municipalities exercised considerable autonomy in the sense of operating with minimal state oversight, and many large cities derive their authority from charters that they have the power to amend as they please. As we know, a fundamental characteristic of American local government is the toleration of inequity in the name of choice. Within and between metropolitan areas, municipalities may provide very different packages of services in different ways and at different levels of taxation. In principle and in practice, American municipalities can make very different choices. The corollary of autonomy, however, is considerable variation in the quality and quantity of services and how and how much residents pay for them. It's important to recognize that from the 1930s through the 1970s, Canadian provincial governments incrementally redesigned municipal systems in most provinces to smooth out inequities on the premise that residents were entitled to similar levels of particular services regardless of the municipality in which they lived. A very different point of view. So the challenge for Ontarians and Canadians more generally, I think, as they contemplate greater local autonomy and differential authority for large municipalities is what degree of inequity or variation, of what type, and under what conditions they're willing to tolerate. And I think this cuts to fundamental political and economic questions with regard to both democratic representation and the efficiency of service delivery. When is a municipality too large or too small? How can this be reconciled with the ever-expanding regional scale of urban development? How much variation is tolerable within any single unit of government? How much variation is tolerable between municipalities in the same metropolitan area, as opposed to those in different metropolitan areas? Should we care more if two Toronto region municipalities like Vaughan and Pickering offer different services and create different built environments than if Windsor and Ottawa do the same? Answering these questions can help us approach a core policy question, which is this. Can we increase local political and fiscal autonomy and empower large cities in ways that promote policy innovation and the making of meaningful local choices while at the same time avoiding negative outcomes? So here's an example of what I mean. And this has an affinity with, I discovered during Enid Slack's remarks, she brought up the same example. Over the past decade, the City of Toronto demanded and was granted access to new revenue sources. But actually using this new authority has proved politically elusive. Local politicians have not sold the public on the benefits of diversifying operating revenues, and in fact have reaped electoral hay from opposing it. The great virtue of local government, its close proximity to community interests and sentiment, may in fact make it politically impossible to exercise greater fiscal autonomy. A second dimension is metropolitan in scope, and this is sort of where we get to the economic side. The City of Toronto was given unique access to these new revenue sources because it was deemed to have special needs. But if a municipality can generate new tax burdens that its neighbors cannot, it risks foregoing investment that will flow to cheaper places in the same metropolitan area. This creates another disincentive to exercising new fiscal authority. The province could, of course, extend the same deal to every municipality, and this point was brought up as well, and it certainly has felt pressure to do so. But would greater fiscal autonomy result in more creative policymaking, or would it result in destructive competition within metropolitan areas, as well-off municipalities drive less well-off ones out of business? Alternatively, the province could simply do the job itself using its superior borrowing power and administrative capacity to make decisions and allocate resources. But this will run counter to the way that we've been thinking about these things in the last number of years. So I think these are important questions in Ontario and other provinces. Last week, Alberta announced that it would move quickly to revise the province's Municipal Act with the goal of enhancing local autonomy and accountability. Earlier, Alberta had pledged to bring in special charters for Calgary and Edmonton that would grant them additional powers and resources over and above what all other municipalities in the province would have. All of this is happening in parallel with often fractious debates over the authority and legitimacy of provincially sponsored metropolitan planning bodies for Calgary and Edmonton, and the introduction of provincially administered plans for broader regions. To the outsider, at least, it's unclear whether provincial and municipal decision makers are thinking about these reforms holistically. How might, for example, strengthening Calgary and Edmonton alter the function and politics of the metropolitan coordinating bodies? Will greater autonomy for the province's other 340 or so municipalities support or undermine the province's regional planning program? Will the sudden shock that is roiling the Alberta economy right now cause provincial planning and support for local autonomy and planning efforts to collapse like a house of cards, much as it occurred in Ontario in the 1970s? So to circle back to my starting point, I'd like to suggest that how we decide to institutionalize local autonomy and differential authority for large municipalities is relevant for urban resilience. This is because the arrangement of authority is an important determinant of the capacity to prepare for and respond to known and unknown risks, some of which may lie far in the future. Ultimately, it's up to the provincial government to structure the provincial-municipal relationship. That's how things work in Canada. My hope is that provinces will do so not simply in response to short-term problems and the politics that swirl around them, but with an eye to fostering what some American political scientists have called anticipatory governance, the ability of policymakers to foresee problems before they occur. Now, I want to be clear that anticipatory governance is not the same as the deterministic blueprint planning that is often identified with the early post-war period. While traditional planning directs capital investments and land use regulations towards a fixed end state far off in the future, anticipatory governance entails designing long-term policy and fiscal frameworks that are compatible with many possible futures, not just one. The cultivation of the capacity for integrated anticipatory governance at the local and provincial levels is therefore a necessary precondition of urban resilience. Policymakers and planners must anticipate sudden shocks and slow shifts, such as climate change-related severe weather events, changing energy costs, an aging society, international conflicts, public health crises, technological innovations, and changing economic pressures. They need to skate where the puck will be, if I can use another hockey metaphor. I did that on purpose. But the thing is that we don't know where the puck is. The puck could be anywhere in the rink, right? We need to be able to create flexible arrangements that will enable us to skate to wherever the puck may end up. Now, at the same time, those are the knowns. There are also, as I think Donald Rumsfeld said, there are the unknown unknowns or something of the like. At the same time, we also have to craft policies and institutions that can respond to unknown futures, transformations and crises that we cannot yet imagine. Now, for political and fiscal reasons, this isn't going to be easy for Ontario or other provincial governments. Electoral timetables are short, vested interests are strong, appetite for taxation is small, funding is limited, but it is ultimately to the provinces that the responsibility for long-term social, economic, environmental health of our urban regions falls. So to wrap up, I think that the Toronto region, Ontario, and Canada are fortunate to have an institution like IMFG, which has the ability to inform policymaking with analysis of current and past practice here and elsewhere. And I think that where we're going to be going in governance discussions, governance and finance discussions, is going to be towards trying to understand how to meet known and unknown challenges in the future. That we need to expand our temporal horizon and think more broadly about what may come, especially as we empower local governments, consider empowering local governments. So here's to 10 more years. maybe 20 more years. I don't know. Thank you very much. And
Well, thank you, panelists. We have about a little less than 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to begin by asking the panel about this, the question I think you all raised in a way about the political economy and how it doesn't necessarily align with what some of the recommendations that IMFG and other people working on these issues might be. Richard mentioned the folly of hoping that some other level of government will raise your money and take the political heat for it. Have you seen in your work anywhere, and I invite any of you to comment on this, places where this has been handled well, or even micro instances where there are strategies in place that somehow deal with this issue that seems to be so often crippling?
Well, if you're asking the general question about political economy, all economists, as they become mathematically obsolete, turn into political economists. So I've been one for quite a while. And it's the kind of question that says, yes, I can think of some examples. Actually, I was going to talk more about resiliency because I think that's really good. I have seen cases where different places under similar pressures have reacted in very different ways, some well, some badly, and I've thought a great deal about why some of them are good and some of them are bad. It usually comes down to not just leadership is not quite the right word, but you have to find the right people at the right time to deal with these problems. But on the question about other people paying, well, the reason that people think that way is because so often it works. I mean, frankly, that's the history, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the the federal provincial equalization thing, to take a current issue, and I look at it, I can't tell you how old I am now. I was a student when the first equalization system went into effect in Canada, so my professor gave me write a paper on it. So I've been writing papers on that bloody thing for 60 years. And, it has changed so often and in so many ways, and it's a perfect example of a place where we really should have worked out a better system for dealing with the endless changes. We never have. It's always been done much the same way. And the one time we did make a real effort to deal with it, we dealt with it really quite badly. That was the last major review. It's hard to say. And usually if you have enough trouble, if I were in a municipal government, I think I would really be complaining and carrying on and making a fuss about how I need more resources and so on, and how I can't really tax my people anymore. And of course, that's what you do. It's always politically better to get the money from someone else. And so that's the natural way to behave. That fits with the traditional paternalistic model of that parents, children whine, they want the car tonight and so on, and give me $20 before I go out. And that's the way municipalities are viewed often by higher level governments. And understandably, because that's the way they behave. But they behave that way because that behavior has been rewarded. We get constant positive reinforcement. And so if you want to look at a system where it doesn't really work that way, the best one I know is probably Denmark, but it's so very different from anything we have here that it's hard to think about. It sort of seems to the outsider like a country in which everybody already agrees on everything, and therefore they don't have any problems. It really isn't like that. A good friend of mine was the what you'd call the minister of local governments for the deputy minister for 20 years, and his stories are harrowing. The way things were negotiated and worked out and carried to things. But it's politics like everywhere else. But there actually is a fundamental agreement. It's actually very much on this issue of the equalization thing. There's a very strong common sentiment that people should not be served too differently on both the local and the national level. And so they work together to kind of constantly juggle things so that works out. And one of the ways it's worked is they are financing local governments primarily through income taxes. Very interestingly, all of them are levying the maximum income tax. To levy. So it looks like a uniform local income tax. It isn't actually. Any of them could lower it if they wanted to. That's something you'd find it kind of hard to imagine perhaps in Canada. But the fact that you find it hard to imagine is the reason that you haven't got it. I think SAC might like that system better than our system. Whereas some people here would much prefer, let's say, the Arizona system, which is like the exact opposite. And it's because we have both of these tendencies that you have so many issues on this. People really do think that because there are poor people in rich cities and rich people in poor cities and middle-class people all over the place, that the income distribution thing is sort of not a problem. And if you cluster all the poor in one, all the rich in the other, then you've got a problem. So if you kind of have a bigger area where they're all together and it's all fuzzed up, then there's no problem. It's just not clear that's the case. That's what the Cape Town thing is about. After in South Africa, and Ina knows this better than me, when organizing the government after apartheid fell apart, I was working with the Finance Commission, and we developed a number of plans for two-tier governance and so on in metropolitan areas, based kind of on the system Toronto used to have, sort of what it looked like. Al Johnson was one of the people, South Africans on this also. And one of the things we did, we thought we'd made a pretty good case, and then they came ahead and they just said, well, no, we have to, equalization is everything. And what we have to do is completely submerge the previous, basic color-based municipalities and put them all in one big thing. And then, of course, we'll structure it so that they don't make us any political trouble, because that actually, Cape Town happens to be where the main opposition to the national government is located. So they've been very, very careful in not to give them too much power. But these tensions are felt everywhere. The pressures, the ways they work out, it's all quite different. So the answer to your question, Alan, is that I haven't got an answer.
Well, I've got a little answer. You said, however small. I go back to the point when people see that they're getting something for their taxes, they're a little bit happier to pay for them. If you look at the congestion charge in London, for example, before they brought in the congestion charge, they invested a lot in buses, so that people found an improvement in transit and an alternative to driving their cars in. And that made them, accept the congestion charge more easily. We've seen these ballot initiatives in the U.S. Where they, state governments usually, they've done them in California, Utah, say we're going to raise your sales tax by 1%, in return for which you are going to get the following transit services. So people feel that the money is staying in their community, it's not going to the capital, that it's going to be spent on services for them. And they, as I said earlier, win a 2/3 majority on a lot of these things. They don't always fly the first time, so sometimes there's a ballot initiative that fails. They keep at it. They really work on it to educate people about what they're going to get, and sometimes that works. But those are very small.
And they run very sophisticated marketing campaigns to do that.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Well, we spent a lot of time on this first question. Maybe we should let someone from the audience ask something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience? There's a microphone in the back. Anybody? No? Here's one here.
So one of the topics...
Could you identify yourself, please, for us?
My name is Anthony Vishnowski, and I'm with the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation in Ontario. So one of the challenges I think that exists is we have this highly uniform approach to the idea of localized taxation and the idea of property tax and its applicability in Ontario. Yet we have, as we've heard, only one actual city, and we have a bunch of teeny places in the rest. And I wonder about, does the panel have an opinion as to whether there's a required critical mass for something to really be considered of sufficient size to deal with local property tax, these local tools, or at some point is there just not enough economic diversity in these communities to allow it to be successful and to manage this idea of the ebb and flow of economic conditions, socioeconomic change, or can it work at this highly micro level that we have in some of the communities that we have in Ontario?
I think the property tax is probably the best tax for smaller local governments. I would think the diversity in taxes that we've been talking about really apply to larger metropolitan areas. But I'm not sure, why you see a problem with the property tax at the local level. It's for small government units.
Not so slow shifts in terms of the transformation in their ability to raise the funds necessary. And so they look to the other levels to bail them out.
So I think for the large metropolitan areas, they can have property taxes and other taxes, and that's where equalization comes in. So the province does provide equalization to, in Ontario's case, northern and rural municipalities are the only ones eligible based on their fiscal need and their fiscal capacity or lack of fiscal capacity. And I think in that context, you do need equalization. The bigger cities go off on their own.
If I took the question properly, though, it was more about the industrial base, the pulp mill closes or something. I grew up in one of those towns, come on. And I saw the mill close. Still struggling. That's a long time now, but they continue to struggle. There is a real problem. One of the reasons that the problem is so dramatic, of course, is that in fact, that's kind of the conclusion of this book on fiscal health that we've done, that we spend too much time looking at the public sector when we're analyzing fiscal health. The fiscal health of a locality is very much a function of the private sector. And you actually have to have a healthy private sector in order to have a healthy public sector, and that's really what your question is about. You said diversity. In Ontario, that usually means, you have a shopping center and you have a plant and you got a bunch of houses. That's kind of and some little retail. That's sort of what you got in a small town. Well, and the plant closes, and you have a real problem, or the shopping center collapses, or whatever it happens to be. But there's no easy answer to those things. When I started studying these things, my professor assigned a topic when we were discussing these questions, and I've always thought it was a very bold thing to say. He called it the ghost town as a policy objective. The principle was that, really we shouldn't be living in some of these places. But this was just at the time of all the closing the outports in Newfoundland, so it was a very topical subject for our part of the country. Anyway.
Well, none of this is particularly new, is it? Long before I was born, we go back to the Beckett Committee in the early 1960s and the Smith Committee in the late 60s. In Ontario, what they were trying to solve is precisely this issue. We had well over 1,000 municipalities, many of them very small, many of them with undiversified property tax bases, and they weren't. Many of them couldn't make a go of it. Their solution: amalgamate. Roll them together. Make sure that you have more economically diverse local government units. We did that with both municipalities and with school boards through several rounds, to the point where we have maybe a third of the number of municipalities that we did in 1940, precisely to solve this problem. So that's the old way. That's the old Ontario way. Structural reform. What do we do today? We equalize, and we get into what I introduced, is this idea of what sort of inequities are we willing to tolerate as a society.
So having invited questions from the floor, I now have to tell you we're out of time. So just before Enid wants to make some closing comments, just before she does that, would you please join me in thanking the panel for their...
Well, thank you very much, Alan. Now I'm no longer a panelist. I'm back being the director of IMFG. So I would like to thank the Premier for her remarks at the beginning of this session, and I'd like to thank our panel and our moderator for a really stimulating discussion on municipal finance and governance, past, present, and future. We asked each of the speakers, including myself, to speak for only 15 minutes, and I can tell you that's a pretty challenging task. So thank you very much. I also, as you probably gathered, kind of if you were really listening carefully and pieced it all together, Zach Taylor was a student of mine, and I was a student of Richard Byrd's. So we have 3 generations here on the panel. This was intentional. A few months ago, I told Alan that IMFG was approaching its 10th anniversary, and frankly, we were both surprised that we had already reached the 10-year mark. And others that I've told too are quite surprised that we're 10 years old. And it brings to mind the adage, time flies when you're having a good time. And I have to say this certainly applies to what we've been doing at IMFG. We have worked hard, we know that, but we've also had a good time. We've had a lot of fun. And I think we've had fun and we've done good work because of the people involved in IMFG. I want to start by thanking Alan Broadbent. I owe him because he thanked me, and I feel I have to say something too, but not the only reason. Alan is our board chair. Let me say in a quick sentence, Alan is an ideal board chair. He's not a micromanager. He doesn't call every day, but he has a keen interest in our work and is always there with wise counsel when we need him. And he's more than a board chair at IMFG. As you know, he moderates panels. He speaks at our events, and he even writes papers for us. He did one last summer as part of our pre-election series. It's been great working with you, Alan. Thank you so much for your support. We also wouldn't have gotten very far without great staff. I'm not going to mention everyone who's worked with us over the last 10 years, but I can say that without them, we wouldn't have been able to produce all the reports that we have produced, done all the research that we have done, and hosted all of these events. So thank you also to the IMFG staff. Our graduate students and our postdoctoral fellows have also contributed greatly to our work over the years by doing research and writing papers and helping us to organize our events. Many of you know that one of the reasons I was interested personally in establishing IMFG at U of T was to encourage graduate students to work in the areas of municipal finance and governance so that the next generation would be excited about these issues, so that there'd be more than 5 people working on these topics. So personally, I feel that one of our greatest accomplishments has been to interest graduate students in economics, political science, geography, public policy, and other parts of the university to work on municipal finance and governance. And many of our current postdoc, former postdocs, and graduate fellows are here today. Thank you very much. And finally, I would like to thank you, the audience, for the support that you have given us over the years. As I look through this crowd, I remember many of you being here at our inaugural event in February 2005, and you've been with us all along. You've supported us over the years, not just by attending our events and working with us on our research projects, but also by using our work to develop policy in each of your fields. That's really why we're here, and your support has been key to our success. So I look forward to working with you, 10 more years, is that what Zach's saying? I'm in. I'm certainly looking forward to working with all of you for many more years and hope to see you at our future events. Thank you so much. And now, because it is an anniversary, we do have to party, and there is a reception outside. Please join us. Thank you.
Agile and graceful.